Welcome to HarmonyTALK, a podcast about dreamers and doers. Hear people from all walks of life tell us about their dreams and the moment they knew there was no turning back as they transitioned from dreaming to doing. This podcast is sponsored by AM Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. My name is Greg Frigoletto, your host for this episode. Today, I am joined by a TV personality and executive producer who has built a career creating, producing, and appearing on some of the country's most popular networks and programs, including being behind the scenes on shows such as The Fourth Hour of The Today Show with Kathy Lee and Hoda, The View, and HGTV's Flip or Flop. He has also amassed more than 300 appearances as a television host, journalist, and pop culture guest on a broad variety of shows, including The Today Show, Good Morning America, The Wendy Williams Show, and many more. At the end of the day, however, Brian Balthazar is a wonderful human being, and by the way, he's really funny too. Brian, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. That's a very nice introduction. Thank you. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to see you, and I have to tell you, Brian, I want to begin by saying how grateful I am for you in what I know is a very busy schedule to set aside some time to talk to me today, so thank you right out of the gate.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, Brian, this is a podcast that looks to inspire by sharing great stories like yours that demonstrate that, in fact, dreams can become a reality. In other words, dreamers become doers. The juicy parts, as we all know, of that journey are typically found between the dreaming and the doing. You come from a small town in the northern Poconos. I know it very well. How did growing up with your family in a small town play a role for you in the dreaming part of your story?
Well, let's see. It's kind of funny. I don't know if this is inspirational. I was not good at sports, Greg. Unlike yourself, you were a very athletic young man. I can't speak to today, but you seem like you still are.
Well, we all grow old.
I, on the other hand, was not, Greg. And so I think they threw a ball at me and I looked as it sailed past me the first time. And then they threw a ball at me the second time and it hit me in the face. So I'm like, well, maybe I should do something else. And so that's how my interest in television was born. I watched television, Greg. I watched a lot of TV. Granted, I wasn't just in the living room watching TV all the time, but I did watch a fair amount of television. And I looked at it as this kind of magical world, both scripted and unscripted. It just seemed like an amazing medium. I don't think I had the words for it at the time. I do remember once, though, as a kid, my mom couldn't find the TV Guide. Younger people may not know what the TV Guide is, but the TV Guide was a magazine that told you what was on because you couldn't just watch it anytime you wanted to. She couldn't find the TV Guide, and I watched so much TV that I was like, oh, I'll just write it up for you. Like I was confident that I knew when everything was on. I mean, I'm joking, but I'm not joking. Those things did really happen. But being in a small town, partly it taught me a little bit about the circle of friends that you surround yourself with and learning to have fun doing sometimes inane, innocuous, silly things because at the time, particularly, we're not in the place technologically that we are today. So you really had to rely on each other to think of fun things to do. And even if that was just hanging out or going canoeing or going swimming or hiking, or you had to get creative in a way that you don't really have to now. There's so many more options, no matter where you are, to keep yourself busy and occupied. So I did feel like I built a nice circle of friends that many of them I'm friendly with today. And so as it relates to dreaming, I think it was going back to the television thing and having supportive parents and supportive friends that nurtured my creativity, thinking that why not pursue that world that was TV or theater at the time. There wasn't a really big theater community in town, but your wife, Heather, and I tried out for a show, Oliver, when we were in 5th grade together. It was her. It's funny, it's all coming back to me now, but like she told me about this play that they were doing in town called Oliver, and her mom called my mom to see if I could go audition. Mind you, I was 11 years old and blonde. So if you're 11 and blonde, you have a good shot of getting the part of Oliver. Like the odds are in your favor right out of the gate. So I got that part and I actually did that show and Heather was there as well. And so that's actually one of my earliest memories of thinking that entertainment and show business was a thing that people actually did and could, pursue. Now, granted, there were a lot of things that happened along the way that kind of rattled my faith in that, but it started the seeds of dreaming and doing.
So it's interesting. I've learned already that my wife Heather may have been an inspiration for you, which is really kind of interesting. And, I think we could probably do a whole entirely other episode, Brian, on, because we're around the same age. And you talk about TV being an inspiration and you watched a lot of TV. And anytime I see anything that says, I love the 80s, I'm all in. There was a lot of really great things to choose from back then. And going back to that original question, and, you've mentioned Heather, you talked a little bit about maybe your mom asking you questions. And as you were sitting there and you were that kid in a small town and you really started to form an interest, was it something that if you would have proclaimed to your mom at the time, boy, I'm really thinking this is a path I want to go down? Because at the time in a small town, maybe a little unconventional, what was an inspiration, or was it something that mom would have supported, or maybe that didn't matter to you at that point?
It's an interesting question, because when I used to tell my mom anything I wanted to do, her answer was never, you can do anything you set out to do. She was more of a realist. She was like, well, I hope you get that. I hope you do it. I hope you get what you want. We're so used to hearing people told they can do everything. And it does kind of create this idea that it's going to be easy. And her, by saying, I hope you do, it didn't necessarily build my confidence in doing it, but it was a very real and helpful level of encouragement to me to like, okay, it's possible, but I have to do the work and it won't be easy. And I actually think that really helped me in the long run. You do have to do the work and it's not going to be easy.
So, Brian, as we were talking about, life in a small town and some inspirations I know from that small town, your next steps were Syracuse University. And if I'm not mistaken, it's now known as Otto the Orange, but back then maybe it was something different. So maybe that was your first segue really into some form of entertainment. But maybe you could talk a little bit about at Syracuse University, and was it at that point that your dreams started to become clear to you, or as you've already mentioned, you were already kind of on your way of knowing what you wanted to do?
I mean, I think I knew at the time I wanted to be in television, but I didn't really know how to get there. I didn't really have a lot of people pointing me in the right direction of what to do. I just went to an open house day there, but I didn't apply to many schools. I didn't have a lot of direction, but even in college and beyond, I really didn't get started in television until I was 28. So it took me a while to figure out what kind of jobs were out there in television and also like how to even get started. But yes, Otto you speak of is Syracuse's mascot. And actually he was named in 91, the year I was there. There are a handful of us that did that at a time because there's multiple events going on all the time. And you would even split a game, you'd be in it for the first half in the costume. And so being a college mascot was an adventure to say the least. A sweaty, sticky, exhausting, but fun adventure. It was fun. And so in a way, running around like a lunatic is comparable to what I do now, but without the costume. It wasn't really until late in my 20s that I really kind of figured out what to do. Even when I graduated from college, I'm like, what do I do now? I majored in speech communication. Syracuse has an amazing broadcast journalism school. That's not what I was in. I didn't get into that one because I didn't have good grades. People would be like, oh, Syracuse, that's a great school for television. I'm like, yes, it is. That's all I would say because I wasn't in that school. So I was in a department that they put the kids that didn't get into Newhouse. It's gratifying to know that it all worked out, and it will all work out. You don't have to go to Syracuse. You can go anywhere and it will all work out if you persevere and work hard.
You kind of mentioned the gap between, you going to Syracuse and when you started to get into TV. And I'm not a mathematician, but there's a handful of years there. So in the industry that you ended up in, it's rarely an overnight success story. And you kind of just alluded to that. So during the chasing the dream part of your story, what did that look like those years when you were really figuring it out? It wasn't handed to you for sure. And maybe there were some hard times.
Oh, there were definitely hard times. And truthfully, like if I were to tell someone who thinks right now they want to be in TV, or I would also want to speak to the people who don't know what they want to do, because I will tell you the years from age 18 through 26 were like, what do I do? What am I doing? How do I do it? Where do I go? What will truly make me happy? And so I spent time working in retail at Williams-Sonoma, the cooking store, which actually was really great, but I knew I didn't want to do it forever. I worked as a singing and dancing waiter on a dinner cruise ship. I worked for a psychic medium as her publicist's assistant. I worked for a PR firm, an insurance company. I feel like I did everything for 3 to 6 months until I was like, nope, this isn't it. Let's keep going. I don't think I went to my class reunion for a while because I didn't have a lot of good news to report. And then I was in Boston and I couldn't afford my rent. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to spend the summer sleeping out of my car for a little while. It was this Plymouth Acclaim, and I would put a suit jacket on one garment hook in the back seat, and then I put another suit jacket on the other garment hook, put the back seat back that goes into the trunk, and just sleep back there. And I worked at a gym because, again, I worked everywhere. And I was a bartender. I would go to the gym to shower, and I would stay with friends occasionally, but I didn't want to impose, like maybe one night, once in a while. But if I wanted to stick around and like really try and give it one more shot in Boston, this was just trying to like find a full-time job that I liked. I just thought, okay, I could go back home, or I could just keep trying a little longer, and it's going to get colder. I'm not going to sleep in my car in the winter. This was a choice, by the way. I don't want to make it sound like I was homeless. I could have come home. I just made a choice that was a little bit unorthodox at the time. It worked out, thankfully.
So it sounds like, there was a little bit of you were on survival mode, but at the same time, there was something that was still inspiring you to keep going because you still were chasing that dream. So something really motivated you. Was there at that point something in particular that made you realize that is still the path I want to take? I'm not going home because this is still something that I want to do.
I think for me personally, like I said, many of those years were just figuring out what would make me happy. I think many of us are like, we can define our happiness in a lot of different ways. It could be professionally, it could be the happiness we find in our family, and the job is maybe a secondary thing. So for me, I was like, what's going to make me happy? Because I had already kind of truthfully thought that TV was out of reach. I thought I was too old to get the entry-level job. Other people had more experience or internships. So I really did. I was just trying to get jobs that I liked. And so eventually I got a job as a writer for a little newspaper. I did an interview with an anchor at the Boston station. And then I went to interview this anchor at the Boston news station, and I saw a posting on the wall for an overnight news writer. And so, well, I can write. I'll just send them, I'm writing this article right now. So I applied to that job. And that was the job that started. We like to talk about big breaks in the business, but I think there's like 100 little breaks. And this was one of the that collectively are all actually big breaks. But that was my first real shot at like getting into journalism in a substantive way. I just busted my ass from there on in, and just like, I'm going to work every double shift I can, because I knew working the overnight shift, I was not going to be seen by the people who do the promoting or the hiring, or, they're all working during the day. So I just like do this shift. And when anyone calls in sick, work the double, work any extra hours I can. And it worked, thankfully.
So I would say, Brian, it's kind of like in an analogous sort of way. If you're a golfer and you're not a very good golfer, let's say, and you go out and you play a round of golf and you have one good hole, that one good hole makes you think, okay, I'm coming back. And it's those little victories that you've talked about that kept you inspired and motivated enough to know I could do this, and kept you going.
For me, it wasn't as much little victories as it was, I love telling the story and experiencing a variety of things. And that actually turns out journalism is very well suited to that, because you're doing a story on one thing one day and you're doing a story on something else the other day. To me, it was part of what was ultimately the adventure of life, is like, oh, I'm going to work on a boat. Well, that's kind of cool for a little while. I didn't get wrapped up in this whole thing. Like, the next thing doesn't have to be the thing. I think a lot of us, particularly when we get out of school or in our younger parts of our career, we think the next job is going to be the job. This is going to be the one, and everything will be great and complete. I will be complete. And it rarely is it. But I think it's also like, okay, to accept the job that's the lily pad job, the one that's going to get you to hop to the next pad. And so for me, I was not upset about working in a life insurance company. I'm like, this is kind of cool. I'm in a skyscraper. I'm from a small town of what? How many people live in Honesdale now? 5,000 people?
About that, yeah.
I was working in a building in Boston that was occupied by 5,000 people. So to me, it was such a trip to be working in a building that had the capacity of my town. And I'm looking out on the 60th floor, and I'm like, wow, I've never worked in a skyscraper before. And I'm like, okay, but this isn't that fun. Let me try something else. Now I'll work on a boat. This is fun. So to me, each one of them taught me something. And sometimes the lesson is that this isn't for you. And that's okay too. Or seeing what elements of something that you like are. But for me, it was like, okay, this will go in the book someday. Will I write a book someday? Hopefully, but maybe not. But I'll have a great amount of stories. And here we are having a conversation about it. It makes my story a little more interesting.
It sure does. And one of the themes that it seems resonated through each of those different parts of your story or adventure is that you seem to chase things that you thought would be fun. And I think sometimes it's lost on people that a priority for whatever they're chasing should be something that they enjoy. And I think for you, that's really important. And you also mentioned that you like the idea of having many different varieties of things. And in your career, you're immersed in so many aspects of the industry, whether it's on the production side of things or the on-screen personality side of things. You cover a lot of topics: pop culture, fine food, architecture, interior design, and even some stand-up comedy. Were those passions that led you down those paths, or did different paths lead you to those things?
I think a little bit of both in different circumstances. And I also believe, and now more than ever, for people who are going after anything, and I don't mean necessarily younger people, it could be a person of any age, you can create a platform for yourself to do almost anything on social media. So if, you're at home thinking, I'm a good baker, but I don't know how to get out there, just start baking and putting it on social media. Suddenly you'll have a following. So at the time, in particular, there's one opportunity for Joy Behar this was before I worked at The View, many, many years earlier, was going to be doing a pilot for a show. It was going to be on CNN at the time. She was still doing The View back then, but they were going to do a show at night. And they wanted me to be part of the pilot. It would never air anywhere. It was just being shot in a conference room. And they wanted me to talk about pop culture with her to see how it went. And I'm thinking to myself, well, how do they introduce me? They're not going to introduce me as joining us now is Brian Balthazar. From where? From what? Usually they tell you, they say what you work for, and I don't have anything. So I'm like, well, I'll start a website over the weekend. So I started a website over the weekend, started writing articles. I only think I wrote 6 articles because they're like, no one's going to look at more than 6. They just, So that was, and I called it Pop Goes the Week. And years later, it was getting hundreds of thousands of hits a day because I just kept going. I did the same thing then when I wanted to pursue food. I created a food website. I was like, okay, if someone isn't going to give me the platform to do it, I'll create my own and therefore build your own credibility, build your own brand. And anyone can do that. And it's never been easier with Instagram, have your own Instagram account or your TikTok account. And that is where a lot of opportunities can lie, and people can see your work without even seeing your resume. They can see what you can do. And so for me, that was a key, is I want to have these experiences. And I also kind of wanted to test the waters and see what I could pull off, what I could do. By and large, in spite of all the struggles, it's really been a fun ride. And I'm so grateful for each and every one of those things.
And those platforms you speak of, as it turns out, were platforms that you were building in areas that were of high interest to you. And in fact, it did work out. And my wife, Heather, as we talked about a little earlier, likes to describe difficult situations and difficult people as fickle. And I think this might be a good term to describe the industry you're in, right? It could be fickle at times. And what do you think right now are the difficult challenges you see in your industry?
Oh, boy. How much time do you have? So, well, we're in a very interesting time economically. The truth is TV is much more than, and movies are, it's much more than just creating and telling good stories now. It's really about pleasing investors and the bottom line. And it's always been about the bottom line. Make no mistake, the economy is based on making money and losing money. But right now, as we deal with a lot of companies that have both linear networks, those are the ones that you flip through on your TV at channels like broadcast television, and then streaming services, we're at a turning point of how well these networks are staffed and how much work they can afford to commission and how much they spend on that show. There are a lot of factors in play. And then being a small company or a large company, really trying to maximize the money that comes in and make the most of it and still have a team of people, of staff that are happy and fulfilled and doing creative work. I think that there's always going to be tons of challenges. It's just trying to adapt to the ones that are happening in that moment and leaning on the things that you love about the business as opposed to harping on the things that you don't. And there's always going to be a little bit of both. Hopefully you'll have more that you love. The short answer to that question, is there a short answer to that question?
I think what you're saying, and my takeaway from that would be, you need to continue to find ways to make things happen instead of harping and wasting time and energy on thinking about all the ways it can't happen.
Right. I think it's called the serenity prayer. It holds true, grant me the serenity to know the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I'm sure I'm botching that to some degree. But it is about okay, accept and face the challenges and change the things you can. And the things you can't, worrying is often wasted energy. And half the things that we worry about, and by the way, I can hear another version of me saying, yeah, practice what you preach, Brian. But there's only so much we can do. And the truth is making things happen is a tricky term because we rely on other people to help us make things happen. So it's all in how you endeavor to do that. And I think ultimately the bottom line is be good to other people, be good to people and treat people the way you want to be treated. Because whether that's like getting a good table at a restaurant or getting a show commissioned or getting a promotion or just getting someone to help you with your work, all of those things, doesn't matter big or small. It's all going to start with how you behave around other people. And that's what I got from small town living. And particularly my mother taught me, hopefully, if I learned something, it was to treat people well, which she did incredibly well.
And that's actually, you kind of led down to a question that I had for you, and I would compliment you through this question. So through the discussions we've had, I've always found you to be grounded, and even with the successes you've had, which are not debatable, you've had a very successful career already, the doer part of your story, as you will. You've always remained humble and grateful and kind, and you've just talked a little bit about where that comes from, your mom. And knowing what you've just said, is it something that you are cognizant of and work on, or does just the day-to-day grind sometimes have you forget that piece of what's important, that human element? And how do you view all of that?
Oh, gosh. Well, in the entertainment business, which is riddled with no's and often feelings of inadequacy, whether I'm producing something or appearing on a show, which I do also, or trying to get an on-camera job, particularly that can be a little bit more personal. It can feel more personal because, when someone says, back in the day, people used to sell vacuums door to door, right? And a homeowner would say, I don't need your vacuum. I don't want your vacuum. Well, if you're working as a host or an actor or a comic and you propose yourself for a show and they say no, you're suddenly the vacuum cleaner they don't like and they don't want. It's very hard to detach yourself from, and people say it's not personal. And the truth is it isn't, but our egos are. So it's very hard to navigate that. But I will say, after a while and you establish some success and it builds upon that, I think it's an important balance to have and understand the difference between confidence and arrogance, because you also don't want to be a doormat. You want to be grateful and you want to be humble, but you also don't want to be walked all over, because there are people that will, and that's not limited to show business, So I do think it's about checking yourself and understanding when it's okay to say, I'm good at this and I can do this, versus saying, please help me, I'm not sure I'm good at this. And so if anything, I think I try to make sure that I'm making a greater effort to be confident than humble. Humble comes more naturally to me and grateful. That fortunately, I'm glad for that. I would rather that than the alternative. I know plenty of people who lean in towards their perfect side too much, and that's not who I am. I just can't take myself that seriously.
And I think confidence is something that a lot of people would agree is a trait that they need to work on, because if you ever get to the point, I think, where you're overconfident, that could be counterproductive in and of itself. So where does Brian Balthazar go from here?
You're supposed to tell me that, Greg. I don't know. I don't know.
My guess is your phone is buzzing up as we speak, and there's already 3 things you have to do when we're done with this conversation.
I ask myself that every day. And by the way, the truth is this is a business that's a bit more cyclical and fickle and evolving than most. In my mind, it is, because, I'm in production on 2 shows right now, and one will get done in October and the other will get done in November, early December. And after that, I have other things in the pipeline, but, it's not like there are these things that are going on forever often, So you just have to get used to the idea that, okay, then we have a push to do other things. So that question, where do I go from here, sounds like it's rooted in confusion, but it's okay. I don't think it necessarily needs to be. I think it can be like, where do I go from here? Can also be, where do I want to go from here? As opposed to there's a certain level of helplessness and confusion that comes with the original expression, where do I go from here? It can sound like it's hopeless and helpless. But if you just shift the words a little bit to where do I want to go from here, there's an inherent level of optimism that comes from that, because it's inherently speaks to infinite possibilities, right? And so for me personally, I like to think of it that way, one, because I've been at some jobs for a very long time and I've been at some jobs for a very short time. And one thing that I've told myself and feel very good about is that how we define success is not by the length of years on your resume. Sometimes you walk away from something because you've learned everything you need to learn, or you're walking away from something because it was toxic, or because you want to experience something new. I love change. I look back now, I'm like, oh, that makes sense that I did all those things, because I love mixing it up and changing it up. So where do I go from here is part of the great adventure. What do I want to do next is part of the great adventure of exploration. And it's a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation with you because often we don't talk to people about these things. It's not always considered a safe place to do it. You have to really feel good about the person you're talking with about it. So thank you for that. So what's the answer? I don't know. I mean, I'm going to keep doing this. I love that my job is the production side is very driven by what I do. And then the part of me that's on camera is very driven by other people. I never know if I'm going to get a phone call or an email that says, Brian, can you be on TV in 10 minutes to talk about? 2 days ago, it was Madonna. Yesterday, it was about Britney Spears and her split. So there's some things that I never know what that email in my inbox is going to be. And hopefully it's going to be something exciting. So I'll do what I can to chase the things I want and see what other adventures pop up in my inbox or phone calls along the way.
You talk about where do we go from here? And I would say that that's a very important question we all need to ask ourselves. But I also think it's really important to be able to enjoy the moment you're in. And I have to tell you, Brian, for me personally, I have thoroughly enjoyed this moment with you and you being able to share with us all the different phases of your life thus far, from the dreaming to the doing. And the good news is there's a lot of doing still ahead of you. And I'm very confident after speaking with you today that there are just great things ahead. I can't thank you enough for being here at Harmony Talk today. And I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a blast. Appreciate it.
So, Brian, as we move forward and people should be interested to follow, where would they be able to find you?
I love a follow. Thank you. I'm on Twitter, Facebook. I guess it's called X now. I am on X, Threads, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, all as my name. Fortunately, there aren't many people with this name. It's Brian, B-R-I-A-N, Balthazar, B-A-L-T-H-A-Z-A-R. And yeah, I'd love a follow. Love to stay in touch. And if anyone wants to pop me a note, I'd love to hear from them.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I've been talking with Brian Balthazar, TV personality, executive producer, and genuinely great guy. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to follow Brian on his social media platforms and check out his work. This has been Harmony Talk by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm Greg Frigoletto. Thank you, Brian, and to those listening as well. Keep dreaming and doing.